Do the best you can, and these huge sound speakers are in the trees because you're lip syncing, and so they're belting out.
It was supposed to be a simple shot. 7 children in a gazebo, a few lines of dialogue, and music as sweet as the Austrian Alps. But something went wrong that day on set. Not a tragedy, not an accident. Something much stranger. A childish, unexpected sound kept ruining every take. The cast tried to keep it together, but each time it echoed, they broke down laughing. The moment was small, ridiculous even, and yet it nearly derailed the film's most emotional scene. The studio tried everything: re-records, editing tricks, sound design. Nothing worked, so they buried it. For decades, no one said a word. Not Christopher Plummer, who famously resented the film. Not even Julie Andrews. Not until years later, when a casual TV interview cracked open the truth, and a forgotten secret floated back into the spotlight. But long before that chaotic filming day, there was another twist, one that no one in Hollywood saw coming. Back in 1956, a modest German studio had released 2 films inspired by Maria von Trapp's memoir. In post-war West Germany, they were box office juggernauts, spreading across Europe and Latin America with surprising warmth. But American producers? They laughed. Too old-fashioned, too quaint. Then, in a bizarre stroke of fate, Paramount sent Broadway director Vincent J. Donahue to scout European stories. He wasn't impressed either. The films felt clunky. But something about the heart of it all, the family, the escape, the music, stuck with him. So he pitched something radical. Don't make this a film, he said. Make it a Broadway musical from Mary Martin. Then fate nudged again. When she and Wozner returned to the U.S. by ship, they landed in San Francisco. Halliday was waiting on the dock. He handed them tickets to see Mary Martin in Annie, Get Your Gun. Maria was charmed, impressed even, but she had to confess. She'd already signed away the rights to the Germans. Still, she said, "You're welcome to try." That try would soon rewrite musical history. Initially, the idea was to blend traditional Austrian folk songs with a few new numbers by Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein. But the duo pushed back. Mixing their Broadway style with folk music would never work. They made an ultimatum. Let us write the entire score or we walk. The producers waited. Rodgers and Hammerstein wrapped up Flower Drum Song, then began work. And when The Sound of Music opened on Broadway on November 16th, 1959, the risk paid off. Big time. Mary Martin led the show alongside Theodore Bikel. It cost $400,000 to produce. Peanuts by modern standards. But advance ticket sales soared past $232 million in today's dollars. The show ran for 1,443 performances. Martin missed only one. Less than a year later, a bidding war erupted over the film rights. 20th Century Fox won with a $1.25 million bid. Over $13 million today. But the deal included a clause so bold, most thought it was a joke. If the film made over $12.5 million, the writers would get 10% of the profits. Nobody thought that would ever happen. Casting the film, though, was chaos. Julie Andrews had just been snubbed by Warner Brothers for the screen version of My Fair Lady. They cast Audrey Hepburn instead. Andrews was told she wasn't glamorous enough, not screen material. But director Robert Wise watched unfinished footage of her in Mary Poppins and saw what others missed. "Sign her," he told the studio, "before someone else does." Andrews signed for $225,000, a flat fee with no royalties. Today, that's about $2.3 million. Compared to Mary Martin's $8 million from the stage version, it was a steep underpayment. Fox would soon regret it. Captain Von Trapp was even harder to pin down. Christopher Plummer turned it down repeatedly, calling the role boring and stiff. He demanded rewrites, more passion, and a solo song that gave the character emotional depth. Robert Wise tried everyone: Sean Connery, Richard Burton, Bing Crosby. No one fit. Finally, Wise flew to London and convinced Plummer to join with creative control over his role. Even so, Plummer loathed the experience. He dubbed it The Sound of Mucus, and later admitted he was drunk during several key scenes, including the family's emotional final performance. Fox was hanging by a thread. The studio had nearly collapsed after Cleopatra, a production that hemorrhaged money. They sold off their backlit. Executives were fired. They were desperate. The Sound of Music was a Hail Mary, and it worked. But Julie Andrews, the face of the film, never saw a dime beyond her original check. Even as box office numbers soared, Casting the Children came next. Mia Farrow auditioned 3 times for the role of Liesel. She was 20. The notes from casting were brutal. Soft, sweet, but no energy. They said she couldn't dance. Ironically, Charmian Carr, who won the part, was actually older, 21, but she had something electric. Farrow would go on to Rosemary's Baby. Other young hopefuls included Kurt Russell, Patty Duke, and Terry Garr. But it was 15-year-old Nicholas Hammond who won the role of Friedrich. Years later, he'd become the first live-action Spider-Man on TV in 1977. The bond among the child actors was real, and it lasted decades. Even as adults, they often reunited, with Andrews and Plummer staying in touch long after filming ended. And then it happened. In 1966, just 18 months after release, The Sound of Music did the impossible. It overtook Gone with the Wind, unseating it as the highest-grossing film of all time. It had stood at the top for 27 years. Wars came and went. Television arrived. But nothing touched it until this. And this wasn't modern inflation. This was real-time dollars. People weren't just paying more. They were showing up again and again. By the end, over 283 million tickets had been sold. That's nearly 1 in every 12 people alive at the time. The songs echoed in languages they weren't even written in. Across continents, across cultures, strangers hummed the same melodies. No Twitter, no global campaigns. Just pure human connection. One film, one family story, and a handful of unforgettable songs. It was more than a movie. It was a movement. At the 1966 Academy Awards, it swept Best Picture, Best Director, Best Sound, Best Editing, and Best Score. In a year filled with heavy hitters like Dr. Zhivago, it was a feel-good musical that stole the night. Robert Wise, who had already won for West Side Story, cemented his place as the genre's maestro. And yet, for all its triumphs, The Sound of Music was just getting started. Because what came next would unravel everything we thought we knew. Every frame of The Sound of Music was crafted to look effortless. Pristine visuals, warm harmonies, seamless editing. But behind the illusion was a production held together by sheer determination and last-minute fixes. One of the most cherished scenes, the moonlit confession between Maria and the captain in the glass gazebo, was anything but romantic on set. The lighting was meant to cast a soft, dreamlike glow, but the equipment responsible for it, those massive carbon arc lamps, produced an absurd, unmistakable buzzing, a sound so oddly flat and wet that it sent everyone into uncontrollable laughter. Every time Julie Andrews and Christopher Plummer leaned in to kiss, the sound would erupt again, like a mischievous prank with perfect comic timing. They tried take after take, 20 in total, each one ruined by either the noise or their own laughter. Plummer would whisper Maria, "I love you," only for the moment to be obliterated by another prolonged raspberry. It felt like sabotage. The studio, desperate to protect the film's spotless reputation, imposed silence. No talk of failed takes, no interviews about the on-set laughter. The press was given a polished version of events. But time has a way of loosening secrets. Julie Andrews eventually began to share the story with a glint in her eye on late-night talk shows, revealing the truth behind the moment. Christopher Plummer, however, never found it funny. He loathed nearly every part of production and rarely missed a chance to say so. He thought the film was too sweet, too hollow. To him, it was all frosting and no substance. His frustration wasn't just creative, it was personal. During filming, Plummer struggled with isolation and unhealthy habits. He drank heavily. Salzburg, with its postcard beauty and endless sentimentality, became his emotional cage. He delivered his lines with professionalism, never broke character. But inside, he was boiling over. Years later, he'd admit that pretending to care in that role was the hardest acting job he ever had. The irony? His performance, done in emotional resistance, became one of the most beloved in cinematic history. And then came the music festival scene. Captain Von Trapp's solo rendition of Edelweiss, sung with tears welling in his eyes. On screen, it's a moment of quiet power. In reality, Plummer was drunk. He later confessed in his memoir and on DVD commentary that he was completely gone during the shoot, calling himself arrogant and ungrateful at the time. Still, the emotion came through. Somehow, even in that state, he delivered something audiences have never forgotten. They saw sincerity, unaware he could barely stand upright. His distaste for the film never really faded during production. He referred to it sarcastically as S&M or the sound of mucus in private and even in public interviews. He said it felt like flogging a dead horse. Everything too neat, too clean. Still, he did his job. And decades later, something shifted. He started to look back with quiet appreciation, realizing that while he'd mocked it for years, it had etched itself into film history and into the hearts of millions. One detail fans often miss is that Plummer didn't actually sing all of his own songs. The lower notes and shorter phrases were his. But the more demanding passages? Those belonged to Bill Lee, a Disney regular and professional vocalist. The blending was masterful. Not even die-hard fans noticed. Plummer wasn't thrilled. He felt something had been stolen from his performance. But ultimately, it was another example of movie magic covering behind-the-scenes compromises. And it wasn't just the adults facing obstacles. 5-year-old Kim Carruth, who played Little Gretel, had a terrifying near-drowning experience during the lake scene. She couldn't swim. Julie Andrews was supposed to catch her when the boat capsized, but Andrews fell the wrong way. Kim went under twice before another cast member jumped in and pulled her to safety. She vomited after swallowing water and was deeply shaken. For years, she couldn't go near water. Even Andrews paid a steep physical price. That legendary opening shot, her spinning in the meadow, required a helicopter to circle her repeatedly, just feet from the ground. The wind from its blades slammed her into the dirt every time it passed. She was knocked down 6, 7, maybe more times, each time hitting the grass with force. But she kept smiling, kept turning, kept pretending. What looks like joy on screen was, in reality, a battle with brute force. The physical toll continued with Daniel Truitt, who played Rolf. He was just 20 when his hair was bleached for the role, so aggressively that it never fully recovered. Fans would later approach him, confused by his dark hair, unaware that the Aryan look came with permanent consequences. Even Andrews had her own hair nightmare. Producers worried the back of her head looked too shadowy, so they sent her for highlights. Something went wrong. Her hair turned a shocking orange. The solution? Cut it shorter. Dye it platinum. The result became iconic, but in the moment, it felt like a disaster. But the most haunting truth wasn't in production chaos. It was what the film chose not to say. For all its warmth and charm, The Sound of Music barely acknowledged the full horror looming beyond the hills. The rise of fascism, the erasure of Jewish voices, the cultural genocide unfolding across Europe, all of it was softened, romanticized, or skipped entirely. Famous Jewish conductors like Bruno Walter and Otto Klemper had already fled Austria. Music by Jewish composers had been banned. The Nazis had even created a segregated cultural organization, the Jüdischer Kulturbund, as a way to contain and censor Jewish expression. None of that made it to screen. Instead, audiences watched a family walk through wildflowers, then hike over the Alps into a stylized version of Switzerland. But the truth? That mountain path in the final scene leads straight into Germany. Even the romance at the heart of it all, the film's emotional core, was pieced together from fantasy. Maria herself would later admit that she married George not out of infatuation, but duty. He'd asked her to stay, not as a wife, but as a mother to his children. "I liked him," she said candidly, "but I didn't love him." They wed in 1927, years before the shadow of the Third Reich even touched Austria. A 25-year age difference separated them. Maria was just 22, George 47. Their love, as she described it, blossomed over time, slow and uncertain. Yet the movie sold their marriage as instant, sweeping devotion on the eve of catastrophe. A narrative curve built not for truth, but for effect. That wasn't the only liberty taken. The real Von Trapps had 10 children, not 7. George's first wife, Agatha Whitehead, bore 7. Rupert, Agathe, Maria, Werner, Hedwig, Johanna, and Martina. After marrying Maria, he had 3 more, Rosemarie, Eleanor, and Johannes. Hollywood didn't just change their names and personalities. They erased them. Agathe, for example, was transformed into Liesel, the bubbly teenager skipping through raindrops with Rolf. In truth, Agathe was serious, painfully shy, and nothing like the coquettish figure we met on screen. When the family watched the film, they reportedly burst into laughter seeing her rewritten persona. But that laughter carried a sting. The industry had scrubbed away their realities, shaping a story that better fit its glossy framework. And then there was Edelweiss, haunting, delicate, and so convincingly nostalgic that even President Reagan quoted it in a 1984 state dinner, believing it to be a traditional Austrian folk hymn. It wasn't. Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote it in 1959, specifically for the Broadway musical. In fact, it was the very last song Oscar Hammerstein ever penned before his death from cancer. Designed to mimic a national farewell, it fooled millions. The emotional weight it carried of heritage, loss, love was entirely manufactured. Austrians weren't taken in. They never saw it as their anthem. But in the U.S., it became a cultural mirage, familiar, false, and deeply effective. That veneer of charm didn't sit well with everyone. The Salzburg Marionette Theater, an institution dating back to 1913, flatly refused to work with the filmmakers. When asked to create puppets for the lonely goat herd sequence, their response was swift. This is a classy operation. We don't want to be in a tacky Hollywood film. Beneath the puppets was a deeper protest, one of artistic integrity. They'd spent decades refining techniques now recognized by UNESCO, and Hollywood's glossy treatment felt like a threat to that legacy. Ironically, after the movie's global success brought swarms of tourists, the same theater eventually launched their own Sound of Music marionette production, capitalizing on the very tide they once resisted. Across Salzburg, resentment simmered. Locals bristled not at the music, but the history. The film painted Austria as a helpless bystander swallowed by Nazi aggression. But the truth? Far murkier. Before the Anschluss, Austria was under an authoritarian regime that actively jailed Nazis, but also suppressed democracy. From 1934 to 1938, it was a repressive state, not the land of innocent songbirds and mountain picnics. To many Austrians, the movie flattened their past into a tourist-friendly fairy tale. Nicholas Hammond, who played Friedrich, later admitted, "The town didn't want us there. They gave no help to the production." The charm audiences felt was, in many ways, a projection. On the ground, tensions ran deep. Even Maria von Trapp, the very woman whose memoir inspired the entire franchise, was left sidelined. She'd unknowingly sold the rights to German producers in the 1950s, forfeiting any future claims when Hollywood came calling. When the American version exploded into a global sensation, Maria wasn't invited to premiere. When she asked for tickets, they told her the seats were full. Imagine being erased from your own legacy, locked out of a narrative that reshaped your name into myth. Meanwhile, Julie Andrews, whose porcelain voice and radiant smile had just conquered the box office in Mary Poppins, wasn't interested in playing another spoonful of sugar. From day one, she questioned how to keep the story grounded. How do we make this real? She repeatedly asked co-star Christopher Plummer and director Robert Wise. She feared the film might drown in its own sweetness, mountains, melodies, and perfect children forming a recipe for saccharine overload. Her instincts were sharper than most realized. Behind the camera, she scrutinized every scene, reshaped dialogue, and insisted on nuance. Her fight wasn't about ego, it was about truth. She wanted grit under the glitter. Still, there were bigger storms in sugar and sentiment. The studio was on the brink. With an $8.2 million budget already high by 1964 standards, the rain-soaked delays in Salzburg threatened to bankrupt 20th Century Fox. Cleopatra had nearly done it already. Now Sound of Music was shaping up to be another misstep. Rain poured endlessly. Equipment rusted. The crew, over 250 strong, sat idle for days. Director Robert Wise had planned for 6 weeks. It ballooned into 11. Every extra meal, every soggy camera, every rescheduled shoot edged production closer to disaster. Years later, Julie Andrews would become synonymous with elegance and discipline, but her off-screen life told a different tale. At her peak, she invested wisely and lived expansively. Known for her taste in vintage cars, Andrews once owned a Jaguar XK150, and now keeps a restored 1967 Mercedes 280 SL. Her watch collection includes a rare Patek Philippe Calatrava and a diamond-encrusted Cartier tank. She resides in a multi-million-dollar Manhattan apartment and a hillside estate in Sag Harbor, both protected under insurance packages tailored for high-net-worth entertainers. She's held quiet stakes in publishing ventures and served as co-creator of a successful children's book line with her daughter. Despite her fame, she's avoided overexposure, focusing on preserving her voice and image with carefully structured endorsement deals and speaking appearances. Financially, she remains a model of restraint and calculated longevity. Proof that grace, when paired with strategy, can yield quiet empire building. For decades, the sound of music has wrapped itself around our memories like a lullaby, warm, perfect, and safe. But behind the curtain was a story far messier, more human, and in some ways, more inspiring than fiction ever allowed. Maria Von Trapp's journey wasn't about fairy tales. It was about resilience, reinvention, and losing control of your own legacy. And Julie Andrews? She didn't just play a role. She quietly redefined what it meant to be timeless. If you felt something new watching the story unfold, let us know in the comments. We're just getting started. Subscribe for more untold truths, hidden histories, and iconic legends you thought you knew.